Welcome everyone to today's Norms and Behavioral Change talk. This is hosted by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. My name is Samira Sayed. I'll just be facilitating today's session. I'm the managing director of the center. And we have quite a compelling set of talks for you today, one of which is going to be by an early career researcher, Dr. Riana Brown from the University of Pennsylvania. And our main talk today is going to be by Dr. Bohnet from the Harvard Kennedy School. After both of these talks, we'll go ahead into a Q&A session as well. Just for those of you who might be new to the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics is a research center at Penn, and we work with institutions throughout the world in the areas of consulting, research, and training services that we provide for institutions that are working to enact some sort of positive behavioral change. In terms of our NoBec talks, so our talk today is the last one for this year. And the schedule that we have lined up for 2025 is as follows. There's a couple of talks in the latter half of next year that are still being finalized. But this is just to give you an indication of what's coming up in 2025. And using the QR code, you can visit our website to learn more about the upcoming talks and also to see recordings from past talks as well. One more thing that I'll share before we get started is that we hosted a Norms and Behavioral Change conference in October of this year. And the recording of that 3-day conference is up on our YouTube handle. So you can follow the QR code or use this link to be able to view this conference that we held, and the theme of which was on political polarization and democracy. So just a heads up on that as well. And with that, a couple of notes as we get started. You should automatically be muted, but as our speakers are presenting, we just kindly ask that you mute yourself. Please do keep your camera on if you can, so we can have a more interactive dialogue today. And for questions, please feel free to use the chat at any time or raise your hand when we have a Q&A segment towards the end of today's session. And so with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who's an early career researcher, whose name is Dr. Riana Brown. So Riana is an incoming assistant professor at the Ohio State University as of January 2025, and is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Riana received her PhD in social psychology from New York University, and her research seeks to understand the way people react to and seek to mitigate or not societal problems such as racial inequality, poverty, and climate change. Let me just stop sharing now so that Riana, you can go ahead and share your screen. And as you do that, I'll share with folks that Riana's presentation today is on the following: highlighting health consequences of racial disparities sparks support for action. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Riana, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. So as you just mentioned, I'll be talking about some work that looks at how highlighting health-based racial disparities spurs support for action. All right. So different inequalities and disparities between different social groups persist in a variety of important life domains. For example, nearly 20% of Black households in the U.S. experienced food insecurity in 2021, over 3 times the rate of white American households. Black and Hispanic Americans are overrepresented in poverty compared to their white, non-Hispanic, and Asian American counterparts. And more than 90% of Black Americans say that they've been racially profiled while shopping. So these are just a few examples in different domains. So food insecurity, considering whether people are getting what they need to stay healthy, poverty, whether they're experiencing economic despair, in which that there are disparities between Black and white Americans in the United States. And so given that, we wanted to seek and assess, does exposure to specific racial disparities in these different domains, such as focusing on health or economics, spark support for mitigating action? And so again, racial disparities occur in a variety of important life domains, and our work focuses on racial inequality in domains that social scientists regard as vital to well-being and life fulfillment. So health-based disparities occur when social groups differ in their exposure to violence or other forms of physical dangers, disease, or injury, and when physiological needs are insufficiently met. Economic disparities reflect group differences in access to wealth, income, jobs, and resources. And belonging-based disparities involve group differences in experiencing positive or negative interpersonal treatment. And we predict that health disparities may be viewed as particularly harmful because health-relevant physiological needs are considered more fundamental than economic security or belonging-related needs in Maslow's classic hierarchy. Additionally, health issues, or broadly the protection of human life, are often considered sacred moral values. And sacred moral values have infinite or transcendental significance, and they preclude comparisons and trade-offs. So they're considered morally imperative to protect over non-sacred concerns such as economic issues. And when these moral violations are violated, people often feel outraged and seek to act against that violation. And so given this, we predict that people will seek to alleviate health disparities over economic and belonging disparities due to this perception that health-related disparities violate our morally sacred values and are therefore considered more unjust. And so we test this in a series of 6 total experiments, 5 initial studies across a variety of platforms. So we had some online samples. We also used Facebook ads. We had a nationally representative sample as well. And so I'll go through all of these in turn. So the first 2 studies methods were very similar. So participants were exposed to 9 examples of different racial disparities. 3 examples focused on health-related disparities. So, for example, participants read that Black American communities have less access to hospitals, pharmacies, and medical care compared to white American communities. 3 examples focused on economic disparities. So, participants read how Black American communities experience lower home ownership rates, leading to less wealth compared to white American communities. And 3 examples focused on belonging disparities. So participants read that Black Americans feel less welcome in shops and public spaces compared to white Americans. And after reading each example, participants reported both how unjust they felt the disparity was and whether they wanted to take action to reduce this disparity. Okay, so looking at the results, just to quickly orient you to this graph, on the x-axis, you can see the different disparity domains that participants were reading about, and on the y-axis was their general support for wanting to take action to reduce the disparity. And so in this study, we found that participants reported wanting to address issues of health-related disparities more than economic or belonging-related disparities. And we replicate this pattern when we had a subset of half Black American participants and half white American participants, where both of these participants reported wanting to address health issues more than economic or belonging related issues. And we found in this study, additionally, we also asked participants how likely would you personally be to want to engage in actual concrete actions, such as donating money to an organization to reduce this disparity, post information on social media, and attend a protest. And using that as a scale, we find the same pattern where participants report wanting to engage more in these concrete actions if they are focused on addressing health-related disparities compared to economic or belonging-related disparities. And we also found that participants reported wanting to address economic disparities more than belonging disparities. In this study, we found that highlighting heightened support to address health disparities is in part due to perceptions that they are considered more unjust compared to economic and belonging-related disparities. So moving away from presenting people with specific examples of disparities, study 3 provided people with definitions of disparities. So here we move to Facebook, where we ran what's called a split test, which is essentially just a randomized experiment where we put ads on Facebook for 24 hours to assess which ad was considered more engaging. So each ad presented a headline about racial inequality, one focused on health issues, so talked about disparities between Black and white Americans focusing on health, and the other focused on economic issues. And given that health and economic disparities elicited the most and second most support for mitigating action in our first study, we directly compare these domains for a more conservative test. And as we pre-registered, we found that the health ad won, so it was considered more engaged, it was engaged with more, it reached more users, and was therefore, to Facebook's algorithm, considered more cost-effective. That is, the health ad reached 1,200 more users than the economic ad did. And this algorithm also lets us know that the health ad has a 95% chance of outperforming the economic ad in a replication. And so this finding reveals that information about racial health disparities also elicits greater engagement on a large sample of social media users. And now for study 4, we collected a nationally representative sample where we sought to conceptually replicate our results across domains to see whether it elicits more policy support and to test whether our proposed underlying mechanism of a violation of moral sacredness leads to more engagement. And so now participants were randomly assigned to read one of 3 infographics. So a third of our participants read about health-based disparities, a third read about economic disparities, and a third read about belonging-based disparities. And after they were exposed to one of these 3 infographics, they reported how much they supported policies aiming to address and reduce these disparities. And so similar to what we found in the past studies, we found that participants reading about health-related disparities reported more policy support compared to those reading about economic disparities. However, differing from the past studies, we did not find a difference when comparing those who read about health disparities and belonging disparities. But again, in this study, we wanted to assess the mediating role of moral sacred value violation. And indeed, we find when comparing the health versus economic disparity condition that health disparities elicited more support for mitigating policies due to this perception that health issues are more morally sacred and in turn considered more unjust to violate. Okay. So overall, we've seen that people show greater support for policy solutions aiming to address racial health compared to economic inequality. However, solutions to combat these different issues might vary drastically. For example, when considering trying to increase access to healthcare in specific communities, people might perceive these actions to be less costly for advantaged group members and therefore less zero-sum compared to frequently discussed solutions to address racial economic disparities, such as distributing financial resources. And so in study 4, we sought to test if our results regarding policy support replicates when assessing support for a concrete policy that is economic in nature and that does not differ across conditions. And so this policy would be costly for everyone. And so now in this study, all participants read that they would be reading about different policies that Congress is proposing to implement. And half of our participants read that they wanted to increase income taxes by 0.5% for all Americans to address racial health-based inequality, and half read about the exact same policy, but focused on reducing economic-based racial inequality. And so assessing our results here, we find the same pattern as we predicted. So participants reading that the policy would go towards racial health-based racial inequality reported more support for this policy compared to those reading that the policy would go to economic-based inequality. And we replicate this pattern in a pre-registered replication. Okay. So overall, across studies, we found that emphasizing health outcomes spurred greater support for action than highlighting economic or belonging-based outcomes. And this included actions such as attending protests and donating money. We also found that health disparities garnered more social media engagement and policy support. And these effects appear to be driven by perceptions that health disparities violate morally sacred values and are therefore considered more unjust. And in recent findings, we've replicated this pattern when looking at issues focusing on LGBTQ inequality. So we again find that people are more support of addressing LGBTQ inequality when focusing on health consequences compared to economic consequences. And same with policy support, same pattern. So as the broad takeaways, activists and leaders of social movements might spur involvement by tactically choosing how to frame issues. So if we focus on health-made disparities, this might especially catalyze engagement. And so this research helps us to understand why violations of physical needs and safety can be powerful determinants for civilian movements for change. And so with that, I'd like to thank my wonderful collaborators, Dr. Maureen Craig and Dr. Pia Dietz, and I'd like to thank my wonderful postdoc advisor, Dolores Albarracin. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ariana. What a fantastic and very concise presentation. What I'm going to say to everyone in the group is that feel free to place any questions that you might have for Ariana in the chat. And we're also going to have a Q&A segment towards the end of today's session. So we can come to questions later on. And with that, I'll just go ahead and share my screen once more. And I'll go ahead and introduce our main speaker for today, who is Dr. Iris Bohnet. Iris is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and the co-director of the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School. She's a behavioral economist, combining insights from economics and psychology to improve decision-making in organizations and society, often with a gender or cross-cultural perspective. Iris, as I introduce you, I'll just stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. And I'll share with everyone that Iris's most recent research examines behavioral design to embed equity at work. And she's the author of the award-winning book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, and co-author of the forthcoming book on Make Work Fair. And so with that, Iris, I'll hand it over to you. And thank you so much for joining us for today's talk.
Thank you so much, Samira, and hello, everyone. Delighted to be here with you today and talk a bit about a topic that is close to my heart, although now I'm, of course, heartened to learn that people do care more about health disparities than economic disparities. Now, I don't think there should be a competition, actually, between the different disparities, and I'm, of course, in full support and congratulate Riana for her very interesting work. But I now want to take us a bit more into the economic realm and talk about fairness at work. And I'm going to get right into things. And instead of starting with research, I thought I'm going to start with Rihanna. Not primarily because she is a great musician, but because she also launched a beauty line a few years ago that's called Fenty Beauty. And it became known in the media because it now offers more than 50 different shades of makeup. And here's what her chief marketing officers had to say about this. So in many ways, that's a great summary of the work that we are doing. We are trying to show more than to tell, and in fact, really try to embed equity into everything that we do. And in some ways, this might be our aspiration to, at some point, reach what other people have reached before us in terms of sustainability. So many of you probably have been in a hotel room at some point, but a room key card did not just serve the purpose of opening and closing doors, but also of turning lights on and off. And that, of course, means that we embed turning the light off into a system. In this case, a little bit of design, a little bit of technology helps people get things right. And that's kind of what we are trying to achieve with our work as well, embedding fairness into everything that we do, in particular in our workplaces. Maybe to give you one example here, I was contacted by the Nobel Prize Foundation a few years ago in 2018, because the Nobel Prize Foundation also was concerned that most, as in 95% of the Nobel laureates, are men, typically white men, typically men from the northern Western hemisphere. And so they invited me to come to Stockholm. And of course, I had to sign an NDA. So many things I can't really talk about. But this is one of the examples that I arrived with, because every year I get a form from the Nobel Prize Foundation inviting me to nominate a person for the Nobel Prize in Economics. And when I arrived, I kind of held up the form and said, there are big things that we can do and there are small things that we can do. And one of them is to explicitly invite nominators like myself to nominate more than one person. And I made that recommendation because of a paper that we wrote a few years ago and came out in 2016, where we specifically looked at these questions of making decisions individually, one person at a time, or jointly. And that turns out to apply not just for nominations, but also for hiring decisions and other types of decisions where you have to evaluate people either one at a time, or you have the luxury of comparing them. And as most of you are behavioral scientists, that's probably not news to you, that we tend to use a reference point when we make those types of comparisons. And our argument was that if I just focus on one person at a time, I tend to go back to the stereotype. So this is the new form. The Nobel Prize Foundation itself wrote about this in Nature, which is why I can talk about this. Of course, I have no way of knowing whether this works or whether this has any impact, but that's to give you a bit of an example. That's a bit our mission here in life and in our research, to move the needles towards more of those types of embedding mechanisms. So we call this behavioral design. We're not the only ones who do behavioral design. Many of you are behavioral designers too. I think how I define behavioral design is that we build on insights into how our minds work. And then we give people, and that's actually very important, the tools to, in fact, turn those insights into something productive. So we don't just raise awareness, but we then enable people to take those insights and turn their organizations potentially upside down. Now, of course, don't do this myself. I want to acknowledge some of my recent collaborators who have all worked with me on this problem here on the funnel. And I give credit to Oliver Hauser, who's now at Exeter, for sharing this with me. So all of us kind of work on some aspect of this, broadly speaking, maybe talent problem, where we want to attract diverse people to our organizations. Then we want to hire them, we want to nurture them, we want to develop them, we want to give them opportunities, we want to give them credit for their work, we want to promote them, and eventually, hopefully, we can close gaps in leadership. What I do want to do today specifically is zero in on 3 ways that inform our thinking on embedding fairness at work. And I am following here an outline that Siri Jalazzi and I are using in our forthcoming book with the same title, Making Work Fair. And we have like 3 broad parts that we focus on. The first one is making it count. The second one is making it stick. And the third one is making it normal. And of course, many of you, given that you're associated with this wonderful lab, have been focusing on the last question. And I also want to spend most of my talk today speaking about making things normal. But I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how we think about the counting and also how we think about the sticking. So before I get into the weed of things, I wanted to quickly acknowledge that much of our work, and in particular Siri's and my book on Make Work Fair, focuses on areas where women traditionally have been disadvantaged, excluded, or even discriminated against. But of course, that doesn't mean that men don't face some of these very same challenges. And I am crediting here Richard Reeves' book on boys and men that I think was for many a bit of an eye-opener, kind of understanding how much men are falling behind in our society. And he coined the term HEAL, which stands for Health, Education, Administration, and Literacy, a bit as a counterpoint to STEM, where in science, technology, engineering, and math, of course, women are still falling behind. So just to give you a bit of a sense of how that has evolved in the last few years, I wanted to show this slide. So it's actually quite dramatic, and I know many of you are psychologists, so I thought this might resonate with you in particular. It is quite striking how the fraction of men has decreased in psychology between 1980 and about now. And then you see other professions which traditionally have been associated with women. And even in those, generally, we see either a downward trend or relatively little movement towards more equal distribution. So certainly occupational segregation is still well and alive. And we do know that stereotypes based on these occupations are also still well and alive. But now let me turn back to areas where women have traditionally been excluded. And I'm going to start with a case study that Siri co-authored and that we teach at Harvard now that I really like because in many ways it drives home the power of counting very quickly. On your left, you see Ross Atkins. He is a talk show host at the BBC, or certainly was at the time this project was launched. And he woke up one morning realizing that he didn't know who he featured on his daily talk show. So he started to count, initially focusing on women and men. In the meantime, this has been increased, also focusing on ethnicity and disability. And by the time it started with women and men, which is why it was called the 50-50 project eventually. And he noticed that women were underrepresented, maybe not particularly surprisingly. But the interesting part of the story is not only did they literally count by hand on sticky notes with Excel spreadsheets eventually, but the fact that they counted turned him and his little team of 5 into something that Cass Sunstein has referred to as norm entrepreneurs. There was no formal project, there was no authority at that point from the BBC kind of imposing counting on the different shows on the BBC, but the example and the fact that it was possible, and the fact that it actually was not just possible to count, but that one could find more women experts, and in fact, get to 50-50 kind of spread across the BBC, very much as a bottom-up project, which is why I think is an example of norm entrepreneurship, where Ross Atkins recruited more people to join the effort, and eventually it became a formal project run by the BBC and then spread across more than 150 other organizations around the world. So counting can be mobilizing, right? Showing us what is happening can be very mobilizing. So now I want to show you a research study that we did that used some of those insights, although in a very particular way. So this is a study that is based on a large organization, in fact, one of the largest one in Australia, which contacted us with the following puzzle. They said that they have people apply to leadership positions. And then given that they've just evaluated everyone, they would love for people to reapply. And so they send people an email and say, thank you for applying. Sorry you didn't get the job, but there are many positions like this one in our organization, so please reapply. And they found that women were about 50% less likely than men to reapply. And so we did a bit of a diagnostic, as you would always do when you work with an organization. But in fact, very soon thought of something quite simple. Namely, we just asked them specifically about what they're saying in the email. And what I just read to you is kind of a summary of what they said. And so that was kind of a first important moment. And then secondly, we asked them who they sent the email to, at which point they told us that they're writing to the top 20% of the applicants. So we suggested to just add this one additional sentence and say that people are top 20%. And that's what we did. And that's basically the experiment. We have a third treatment arm, as you will see on my next slide, where the organization also followed up with a phone call. But in fact, you'll see the phone call didn't make a big difference. So what we did was a control treatment where people got the typical type of email, please reapply, the treatment condition where we informed people that they are top 20%, and then a third treatment arm where they got a little more information, including a personal phone call. And here's what we found. So on your left, you see the control, which basically replicates what they told us before. So women are substantially less likely to reapply after being rejected for these leadership positions. But then when we added the top 20% to the email message, we basically closed the gap. I'm happy to talk more about this, by the way, in the Q&A if you like, but I'm just going to keep going for now. So that should give you a bit of a sense of why counting is important. Counting is literally important to diagnose what's happening. You're all researchers, so no surprise here. It's also important in some cases to actually mobilize people, as we learned with Ross Atkins, and then finally people don't always know how, for example, they compare to others. And so counting can also provide relevant information for people that allows them to understand their relative chances, for example, in this case, of getting a job offer. And of course, we don't quite know why this is happening yet, which is why this is still a working paper. It's an R&R right now, where we're running an experiment trying to unpack the mechanism here. Our hypothesis is gender differences in self-confidence, which is well established in the literature. And we're trying to find out whether this, in fact, is driving these results. Now, just as a footnote, it's quite interesting, right? Because if people were fully rational, telling somebody that they're top 20% shouldn't necessarily demotivate men who think that they're top 5%. You're still top 20%, even if you're top 5. But we're thinking that maybe that is happening because, as you could see in my previous slide, we see movements on both ends. We see that men become less likely to reapply and women become more likely to apply. But more on that once we know the results from this experiment. So the second part of our work focuses on making fairness stick. And in many ways, maybe that's the area where I have done most work in, because I'm so passionate about debiasing systems rather than trying to debias mindsets, where we just have very little evidence that that's working. And so I want to start with a story again and then show you some research. And the story was work with a law firm that led to this New York Times article in 2018, where the law firm wanted to learn more about this typical pyramid that we have, in particular in law firms, where we have enormous diversity. I'm calling it enormous because there are not that many jobs where we literally have 50-50 or even 60-40% women and men at the entry level, and then quite a steep pyramid with about 16% of equity partners being women in the United States. And so we looked at a number of things and did a number of things. So this didn't turn into research, sadly. But we learned about a term that they used, which I hadn't known about before. And they literally said, well, some people come up for promotion, but they just have a thin file. And when we asked what they meant with a thin file, it turned out that what they were describing was that some people, literally had a small deal book. They hadn't been involved in many important deals. They hadn't really been in court very much. They hadn't worked with the important partners. They hadn't been with the rainmakers, with the important clients. So they had a thin file. And then the data, again, told the story here in that thin file problem started in the very first year of people's employment when they were first-year associates, because partners then chose the people they wanted to work with. And we saw in the data that partners pretty precisely replicated themselves in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of nationality. This is one of the large multinational law firms headquartered in New York, in terms of nationality, and even in terms of law school. Again, being in the US, that won't surprise you very much. So what did the law firm end up doing? They ended the program where partners were able to choose the people they wanted to work with. But in fact, now centralized the work allocation, and still today have a central office that allocates that work to the different first-year associates, and then secondly, keeps track of the opportunities that are given to these people over their lifetime. Now, it's not just the cool opportunities that we have to worry about. And I thought I'm going to quickly talk about our students for a moment and about a study that Pinar Doan, a colleague of ours at Kennedy School, did with our students. You'll see this is a small example, but likely an example of something much bigger. Namely, she was interested in who makes room reservations. Now, as is, I'm sure, the case at Penn as well, often our students have to work in teams, and they can either meet virtually, of course, or meet in person. Then they need a room. And that room reservation takes 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I don't know, actually. but you have to log in a central system, have to find a room, might have to coordinate time. So it could be a bit time consuming, actually. And what she found was that this typically is done by women. We have 50-50% male-female students at the Kennedy School, so there's no obvious reason why women are particularly good at making room reservations. Now, Linda Babcock and her collaborators called this non-promotable tasks. Right? So these are the public goods that we all provide for our institutions, for Penn, for your lab, for the Kennedy School. That can be the summer internship program, that can be mentoring, that can be advising, that can be in academia, of course, serving administrative committees, etc. That doesn't necessarily count towards your promotion. And so when you think about that performance support bias, where some of us get more support to perform, don't just think about the shiny assignments. They are important, but also keep in mind the types of things that need to happen, but don't give us a lot of credit. So what did the Kennedy School actually end up doing? I thought I'm going to quickly share that because I'm now learning that this is still rather unusual in the academic world. And so I thought maybe you'd find this interesting. So I served for a number of years as academic dean, and so that's why kind of the Kennedy School equity is also close to my heart. So we introduced a faculty workload system, and the motivation to do that was twofold. The first one was very much to make invisible work visible. And that includes the mentoring, the summer internship, the seminar series, et cetera. And how we do that is that we give points to people. So you get points for teaching, you get points for administrative work, you get points for mentoring, you get points for running the speaker series, so for all kinds of things. And that was kind of the first motivation. The second motivation might resonate with those of you in economics. It also now makes things tradable. So not everyone is a great teacher. We hope most everyone who gets tenure is a great researcher. But as you all know, in our types of organizations, we don't actually screen very much for teaching. We also don't screen very much for mentoring, for other types of leadership qualities that we might need in an academic environment. And so things are tradable now. So some people teach more, some people teach less, some people do more admin, some people do more mentoring. And I think it has made us better. Now, I also want to tell you what the downside is, that it's not research, it's just my experience as academic dean. What you might fear, particularly the psychologists in the room, is that this crowds out intrinsic motivation. And I imagine some of that has happened. So I've always had the 3-4 faculty, always the same, who call up to renegotiate their points and basically argue, well, but they should get a half a point more, and, you know, sometimes really nitty-gritty types of things. So that I do think that's a bit the price, but that's a trade-off that we were willing to take. Now, most of the people we work with, and I know you're very much in the world as well at your center, of course, are in academia. And so quite a bit of our work has been focusing on how we measure performance more generally, so outside of academia, where maybe having a workload system is not quite as obvious. And I just wanted to talk quickly about one of our studies that I think might resonate with the behavioral scientists in the room in particular. So this is a study that I was actually passionate about already in 2016 when my book, What Works, came out. Because already in What Works, I write about a concern I had, namely that many organizations ask employees to self-evaluate before they share their self-evaluations with their managers, and then their managers make up their minds. Now, is it really behavioral science that we need to imagine that that could lead to anchoring and social influence? Probably not, but that was my fear. But I didn't have an organization to test this with. And then I came across this financial services company which used this scheme, asked employees to self-evaluate, then share their self-evaluations with their managers, and then managers make up their mind. And they rated employees from on a scale from 1 to 5, and including the self-ratings were from 1 to 5. And so, of course, when you have a firm like that, you never know whether it's social influence or just a correlation. Because of course it could just be the case that my manager and I agree on my performance. So these are all subjective performance appraisals, so we don't have objective performance available, but it could just be we see the same thing and we agree. Or it could be that I, in fact, anchor my manager by giving myself, let's say, a 4. And so we were lucky with this firm in that it had a glitch in the system where they couldn't share self-evaluations 1 year. Now, I know I already see some smiling faces here because you're like, yes, that's a natural experiment. And that's how we felt too. These are the lucky strikes that you sometimes get. I'm making fun of this here now because, as you will see, the results weren't quite as striking. So we thought, okay, great. So we finally got the data, we looked at the data, and it turns out we could see some decoupling. So we can show that social influence is happening. And so that's already quite interesting. We can see that in 2016, the managers' evaluations are much less correlated with self-evaluations, which we have. It's just that they weren't shared with managers. So we can actually look what people gave themselves, and we can also look at what managers gave, knowing that managers did not have access to that information. So we can do that. So that's good. But truth be told, we were actually even more interested in trying to see whether it helps those people who give themselves particularly low self-evaluations. Because, my work is all about gender equity. So I entered this fearing that women, knowing about differences in self-confidence, etc., expectations of backlash, that literature, that might lead women to be harsher on themselves. And in fact, that's what we found. So that's what we saw in the data. In particular, so we found both a main gender effect, but also an intersectional effect between gender and race. And for simplicity of the argument now, I'm just going to do race binary because this is a multinational firm. And so globally, I can't go into specific race categories. Although in the paper, we also do this specifically for the world as a binary variable, and then for the US with the different race categories in the US. But in any case, so we found that women, and in particular women of color, gave themselves lower self-evaluations. And so the hope was, well, if there is social influence happening, maybe if we disrupt that channel, we might be able to equalize some of their final ratings. And in the glitch year, that didn't really happen. And so that was a big disappointment. But also we kind of tried to unpack why this might be the case. And then we saw that our clever managers, of course, not having self-evaluations available for that year, went back to previous year's self-evaluations. So that's right, the beauty and the beast of doing these experiments in the wild. You can't control things like that. But then we tried to outsmart the managers, and we just looked at newly hired people in 2016. In the year when the glitch occurred. And so that's a much smaller sample, of course. It's not representative of the firm, because 1 year you might hire more investment bankers, another year you might need more technical staff, et cetera, et cetera. It's still a big sample. It's still about 10,000 people who were newly hired, but it's not representative of the firm. In any case, that's where we found what we thought we might find, namely that the gap between women of color and white women, between women of color and white men, was actually closed when self-evaluations were not available. So I do think behavioral science, in fact, has much to offer, in particular on performance evaluations, because honestly, I don't think we know how to do them well. Nobody likes them, nobody likes receiving them, and nobody likes giving them. So that's maybe a little bit an appeal for more research. Okay, so now I want to turn with some trepidation to your expertise. And that is how to make fairness normal. And I often start with this slide here. I even use it in my class because in some ways it summarizes how I think about this quite well. So now I've talked to you about counting, and imagine that my problem is cleaning this beach. And so counting could be a first thing that we do, basically just noticing, observing that the beach on the left is much dirtier. So counting is valuable to understand what the problem is, to diagnose what's broken here. Secondly, then I could give you a shovel, for example, or use some technology to help you do the work. So make this stick by not just raising your awareness, but in fact enabling you, giving you that toolbox that I had on my slide before, giving you that toolbox to do the work. Now, here comes the problem, of course, that you might still not care, right? You might not be motivated to do that. You now know there's a problem and you have the tools to fix it, but you might be lazy. Maybe nobody else is doing anything. Maybe you don't have the incentives. There's no authority forcing you, and the social norms might not be that you clean up the beach. And so that's what I want to talk about now. Of course, this problem has many more components that I won't touch. I just in passing talked about incentives, other types of mechanisms that could move a person to clean up the beach that I'm not going to talk about. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 ways in which we might change what is normal. So firstly, I'm starting with role models. And I know many of us still consider the introduction of reserved seats in India in 1993 as the gold standard of trying to understand what difference really makes. And by now, about 25 papers have been written about this natural experiment, kind of trying to see whether this might change anything on the ground, including social norms. And I find the impacts quite striking in that seeing women, and it's typically not just the first woman in office, but the second woman who is in office. And when I say office, I specifically mean pradhans or the mayorships in Indian villages. So villages that have been exposed to at least 2 female leaders, in those villages, beliefs about what's normal are starting to change, including parents reporting that their core career aspirations for their daughters now are to become politicians, but also more direct impacts on voting behavior, women more likely to vote, women more likely to run for office themselves, women more likely to speak up in town hall meetings. So I always, when I talk about this, find the role model effect incredibly powerful. And I just wanted to give you one more study. And this is not the only one. There are a couple of these that I found, again, quite striking, that focused on a much smaller type of intervention where students, including in economics, for example, in Dallas, there was a study on that, were exposed to counter-stereotypical, in this case, female role models for just 1 hour. And the dependent variable on this in the study that I'm talking about now was whether these high school students were then more likely to study these counter-stereotypical subjects. So this is a study that a former fellow at the Women in Public Policy program that I co-direct was involved in, Clementine van Effenterre. And they were able to work with 20,000 students in the Greater Paris area with an existing intervention that L'Oréal, in fact, the L'Oréal Foundation, had started all around the world, not just in France, exposing girls and women, young women, to STEM role models. And what they did was they went into about 100 different schools and had female role models spend an hour with the whole class, so not just girls, talking about their lives, their careers, a bit about bias, etc. And then literally it was a randomized controlled trial. The dependent variable was, are these girls, they were in their senior years of high school, and some other grades, but I'm focusing on the senior year now. Are these senior year high school girls, are they more likely then to choose a STEM major? And that's exactly what they found. So role models are really powerful. And even when you don't see them in person. So I presume that has happened at the University of Pennsylvania as well, at Harvard, and particularly at the Kennedy School a few years ago. The person on your right, Jenny Mansbridge, who was a professor at the school at the time, noticed that of the 50 or so portraits of leaders on our walls, exactly 0 were of women. And as I mentioned to you before, about 50% of our students are women. So this wasn't by design to signal to our female students that they're not made to be leaders. And again, from research, we know that that matters. So we've changed who's on our walls. It spread around the country, or, to other countries, sometimes called the Portraiture Project. So what we see and who we see really does matter. So television, it's everywhere, right? We talked about the BBC, it's in the media, it's on television. I have a German slide here just to be a bit broad geographically on the work that we're doing. This was a fun project because we looked at the interaction between gender and age. And what you can see here on the screen is basically young women on your left, where we have pretty much 50-50 in German television and German cinema, between 2017 and 2020. And then on your right, you have women older than 50, where men are, again, highly overrepresented. So this is the advantage of affinity. And affinity is not normally a term that we use in a positive sense. But affinity, where I kind of emulate people who look like I do, where I prefer people who look like I do, where I learn more from people who look like I do, lead to bonding social capital. I'm using a term coined by Bob Putnam here at the Kennedy School. And that's a wonderful thing. And it's incredibly powerful. It's an incredibly, I find, low-cost intervention to show these role models. However, of course, it can be very costly. And just one quick example that I'm borrowing from Kate Glazebrook of Applied with her permission. Just, notice how often affinity bias could affect our assessment, for example, of a document that you all have and that many of us have evaluated, and that's the resume or the CV. There's just a lot of places where I have associations with the person's name, the person's gender, what the name might indicate about the person's ethnicity or their nationality, their language, where they have worked, the companies, the job titles, just many, many, many different things. So affinity, right, has these very positive impacts when we think about role models, but also, of course, leads to lots of the problems that we care about when we think about bias in organizations. So what else can we do to make fairness normal if the role model impact is powerful, but also concerning in some ways? So then Siri and I actually in our book looked at interpersonal contact theories and the research that has been done in this area, not something that I have been involved in, but that is also quite interesting. And I'm using it here a bit as a contrast to the low-cost, quite impactful role model intervention. What that research shows is that having people interact across differences can in fact be quite powerful, but superficial interactions typically backfire, which is why I have deep here on the slide. So it kind of means deep interpersonal contact can lead to more interpersonal understanding, to making fairness more normal in those work groups, but it really needs to be deep. And so just some examples of some of the studies that have been done. This is a very nice study in Norway where researchers could exploit the fact that women were randomly assigned to base training in the military, and then they could see what difference that made in these different boot camps. And it does help cross-cultural understanding. You might also know about the research, very similar design, on the random assignment of roommates in your first year of college that has shown very positive impacts. And then also in sports teams, the one study I'm thinking of here actually was done in Iraq with displaced Iraqis who were displaced by ISIS, and where the focus was on different religions and bringing people together from different religions. So most of these studies are nice because they have behavioral dependent variables where you can actually see whether then, Christian Iraqis are more likely to want to be in a team with Muslims or choose somebody from a Muslim team to join their own team or give an award to somebody from a different team. Now, the challenge of these types of intervention is that, well, they rely typically on some sort of superordinate identity of, everyone is a Penn student, or everyone is a soldier, or everyone is a soccer player. And they can lead to more bridging social capital. But as I just mentioned, they are incredibly time consuming. So these are not your low cost type of interventions, which is why we, as a team actually of 5, tried to go a completely different route. And you'll see now, this is a super low cost, super quick study that had some surprising impacts. So those of you who know my work know that I have been quite skeptical for the last 10 years or so about the impact of diversity training, not because I don't like diversity training, and of course I am a trainer as a faculty member by design, but because we just couldn't find a lot of impact. We could find sometimes that diversity training increased people's awareness, but there's very little hope in the data that we would ever find behavioral impacts. I should also say, while there are dozens of studies looking at diversity trainings, there's very, very few. Actually, Edward Chang and colleagues produced one of the first ones, and maybe still the only one, with a randomized controlled trial design where they actually looked at an experimental intervention and didn't find very much. So in any case, so Edward is part of this team too as a series. So we tried to think about whether we could make them better. And we were motivated, or I at least was motivated by research that had taken, like, I don't know, when it was actually published, like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that focused on habits, which is why this is up here. And it focused on the habit of wearing seatbelts. And I know probably nobody today has ever been in a car without a seatbelt. It used to be the norm when I was a child, in fact, that people would wear their seatbelts. And so what this experiment was looking at was whether it mattered when people were reminded to wear a seatbelt. And what the study found was that immediacy was absolutely crucial. That only if you told people right before, basically, they were entering the car, and right before, basically, they were turning on the car, that they should wear the seatbelt. So that informed one core piece of our design choices. So basically what we tried to do was, I can't say we threw all of behavioral science at diversity training, but we tried to throw a lot of behavioral science at making these trainings better. And one of these insights was, okay, we need to make them people need to take them not at a random moment in time, for example, during onboarding, but just before they have to make relevant decisions. And so we focused on hiring managers the night, basically, or the week before they had to make a call on who to put from the long list onto the short list in the hiring decision. And so the first thing is time, or timeliness, maybe more precise. The second feature of the design was that it was very focused. Right? We didn't do generic training. It was very focused on the hiring decision. That's what the intervention is all about, gave people more insights into how to do this well. Thirdly, it was delivered by an authority figure, kind of taking the research that recently has come out that accountability is one of the core features in the whole diversity kind of impact literature, kind of seriously. So it was delivered by an accountability figure. And it also then kind of made diversity salient, kind of talking about the fact that we as a firm care about diversity and we want to represent the people we serve. So this is a large technology firm, more than 100,000 employees, active in more than 100 countries. And our sample consists of these managers. And that was our initial thought, that we would have a control treatment with no intervention, and then a treatment where we had this video message delivered by a senior manager on the importance of diversity and how to make hiring more inclusive. Now, the company, in fact, was concerned, and this is a European headquartered company, that maybe the diversity frame wouldn't work quite as well. And so we have treatment 2 here that has basically the same message. Everything else is constant, but frames the whole message more in terms of effectiveness. So think collective intelligence frame here. And here's what we found. So red is the no treatment condition. In pink, you have the effectiveness condition, and in blue, you have the diversity training. And basically, the summary is that something that no researcher likes, but here we are. Effectiveness is kind of in between the control and diversity training. I'm saying this, by the way, not very statistically, but it's kind of, when you look at this, it's kind of true. So typically, more statistically speaking, effectiveness training is not different from the control or diversity training, but where we do get some traction is from the diversity training as compared to the control. Maybe most pronouncedly, take a look at what's on your right side of the screen. When we look at maybe some people have called this double jeopardy. If we look at people who have been disadvantaged because of their nationality and because of their gender, where we find both effects, significant effects on likelihood of being shortlisted and likelihood of being hired after the diversity training intervention. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap up with my last example here. And I thought I'm just going to spend 1 second literally on the important work that many of you, and particularly Christina Bicchieri, of course, have been doing on social norms. I've been a fan from afar for a very long time. And I just wanted to show you how we took inspiration from some of the work that you have done. So a few years ago, I was contacted by this person here. His name is Vince Cable. He was the Secretary of Business in the UK at the time. And the UK was interested in increasing gender diversity on corporate boards. And they sent me at the time in 2013 this brochure, which is the actual cover of the brochure, where what you see is that at the time, 17% of directors were women. Their goal at the time was 25% by 2015, and they were stalling. So they reached out. So that's kind of the background. And as you might observe, we're describing here both an empirical reality, but potentially a desirable reality as well. And that's kind of what we do a lot. We often focus on the absence or the lack of women, for example, given that I'm focusing on these areas where women are underrepresented in positions of leadership, in politics, in government, in business. And you might not be surprised that we were concerned that these descriptive norms describing an empirical reality could turn into prescriptions in our minds, kind of describing what the world should look like. So we redesigned the cover. In fact, Carrie Connolly of the Women in Public Policy program redesigned the cover, focusing on these different boxes that you see here. So we're still describing the same information. These are 100 companies. These are the FTSE 100, the biggest 100 companies in the UK. So every box is one company. And when you see a male and a female icon, that basically means that we already have some diversity on the boards. But then you have 6 companies that weren't diverse at all at the time. And so that's just an example of how we changed, in fact, the whole communication. It wasn't just the cover of the brochure, but also how the government and actually everyone else who was involved in this started to talk about gender diversity on corporate boards. Namely, as in, this is happening. 94% of boards are already diverse. You are really an outlier if you're not part of the club. And now I'm literally going to end with something super unscientific, but I'm doing this just to give you some hope. So the UK has actually made a lot of progress on gender diversity on corporate boards and in senior management. And what you see here is the data from previous year in 2022, I think. We didn't have the 23 available yet, where we now see that we're about at 42% women on corporate boards and about 35% women in senior management. So I'm not claiming that our redesigning how people think about norms was in any way decisive for this impact, but many, many things actually happened. Some I was involved in, some I was not. So if you'd like to learn about anything that I talked about, you might want to take a look at our Gender Action Portal. That's a platform at the Kennedy School that is housed by the Women in Public Policy program that's open access, where you can find research, you can find summaries of the research. Typically, we go back to original authors. When I say typically, always, we go back to the original authors for their final sign-off. But it's a bit of an attempt led by Anisha Sandhi at the Women in Public Policy program to make these types of insights available to the world. And if you want to learn even more, join us for our virtual seminar in the spring. It meets on Monday afternoons. You can just, take a screenshot here if you like, but it's virtual. So it's something a virtue of the pandemic, not that it had many virtues, but where we found that it's actually really lovely to be able to include people from anywhere in the world. And with that, let me stop sharing screen. And I think both of us are happy to take your questions or comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Iris, for that really compelling talk. And also congratulations on your forthcoming book on Make Work Fair. I turn to the group now. We have about 10 minutes to go into a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for Iris or Ariana, please feel free to raise your hand or put a question into the chat. Yeah, we would love to hear from you all on any questions or thoughts you might have. Christina, go ahead. So we turn to Dr. Christina Vicari, who's the faculty director of the Center for Social Norms. Please go ahead.
Iris, thank you for the wonderful talk and all the type of advice that you give, and the role model looks like, role model, trendsetter, etc., looks like the most successful. I am curious about the last slides about England and women on board, etc., where you say, oh, we changed the message, basically. Now, this is possible on certain circumstances when the environment, the social environment, permit it, but very often this is not the case. And among all the tools that you were discussing, like habit formation, I think is hard because a habit takes time. The superordinate identity, the deep contact across, etc., are really difficult, to achieve, especially in the limited time we have, and then, that people will forget. Now, the affinity bias is really interesting because it's something that we all, are subject to. And it's very interesting what sort of tools do you think we have to break the affinity bias?
Yes, you asked me a very, very simple question, Christina.
It's because we all share it. I see it myself.
Yes. And again, it has some advantages in that, we need more male teachers for our boys to learn reading and writing, and we need more female teachers in math for girls to be inspired to become mathematicians. And so, right, so that's the beauty of the affinity bias. So I am not optimistic that we can debias our minds. I do, like you, I feel this is very ingrained in our being, and homophily is just, part of humanity in that sense. So most of our work focuses again on the systems, and because we're trying to, basically say, let's break the link between affinity bias, something we know I have, and my actions over here. So I have it, but it doesn't mean I need to act on it. So just to give you an extreme example, about 12 studies now have looked at anonymization of resumes. But what if we take out names, information, some take out the whole resume, some take out just a name, some remove addresses, which can be, descriptive of socioeconomic background and all kinds of things. So people have experimenting with this. So the research generally is quite encouraging. Now, when I talk about this clearly, it doesn't take away some of the inequities that have happened in the past. Right? It creates an equal playing field at the moment of evaluation of the resume. But of course, some of us have different resumes than others, given the opportunities we're given. So again, there's not a perfect solution, but at least it's a good example for how I think about affinity bias. I think we need to use these types of extreme tools because it's such a strong bias.
And last question, I believe, as you do, that role models are very, very successful. Now, there are many ways to think of role models. Have you thought, because I was very interested when I was working on India and sanitation, some great trendsetter role models were soap operas.
Oh, soap operas. Yes. Oh, yes.
Is amazing. The importance when the character is similar to the person you want to reach. It goes through a lot of problems as the person would go through, etc., but wins in the end.
Yes. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. And I'm also a fan, by the way, of your work on trendsetters, but more generally on soap operas, because I know Riana La Ferrara. We know both know her well, of course. But she's now a colleague of mine. So I know her work well, and I am also astonished, actually, by how powerful some of these soap operas are. And, I don't know whether it's a soap opera per se or whether it is just the popularity of the programs. I mean, Betsy Pallock, right, has interesting work in Rwanda also. Rob Jensen has interesting work on kind of the rollout of cable televisions in India and how that has affected people's beliefs about, for example, domestic violence. And the cable television, just as an aside, basically, it wasn't primarily a role model effect, it was also a role model effect, but it also exposed people to the city kind of life. But I can see you're leaning in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the one important thing that I noticed is that people watch the soap opera, but then discuss it. So there is a sort of community discussion about that. And that's quite relevant, I think.
I completely agree. And I think that's why you and I are aligned, I think, or at least, and let me not put, but how I read your work is to say that, we can change behavior by changing social norms, even if we don't change individual attitudes. So that doesn't mean that I personally have changed that, but my beliefs about what's normal and acceptable in my community have changed.
Exactly. And I think it's absolutely crucial. And it's very interesting to think of different ways to do that on the workspace, basically.
I completely agree.
And, I think you're doing really fundamental work. Thank you. Let people talk.
Great. I was going to say, we're just coming up on time for the session. Is there any final question? Maybe if there's one last question that we have from the group, please feel free to speak up or raise your hand. Okay, maybe we have kind of reached a point where we've saturated everyone's mind. So with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up with today's session. Just major thanks and gratitude to Iris and Riana for your talks today and your contributions to this series. I'll just share one last slide, which is this, just a reminder of an upcoming schedule that we have in 2025, and you can find more details on our website for the upcoming talks that we have next year. And with that, we can just wrap up today's session. Again, Iris and Riana, thank you again so much. And also to everyone who participated. We really appreciate your support and contributions and participation. And we look forward to having you join us again as of January. Thank you, everyone.